Another artist that I would like to talk about in relationship to the philosophies of Emanuel Swedenborg is Hiram Powers, who lived from 1805 to 1873. He's an American sculptor who originally grew up in Vermont, but who moved to Florence in his 30s, so he spent most of his life in Europe. He actually began as a clockmaker, and he didn't begin sculpting until he was 21. He started off by creating wax figurines for a traveling wax museum that illustrated Dante's Inferno. He then began to make portrait busts for his friends. His talent caught the eye of a local patron who paid for him to study in Washington, D.C. and New York. In the beginning of his career, he sculpted many portrait busts for famous Washington elites. So, for example, this portrait bust of Andrew Jackson. He had a very naturalistic style when he began. So you can see the wrinkles on Andrew Jackson's face, you can see the drawn cheeks and the toothlessness of Andrew Jackson. When Jackson was asked about what he thought of the portrait, Jackson said, "Make me as I am, Mr. Powers, and be true to nature always." But Hiram Powers wasn't always true to nature. In fact, he soon left naturalism for a kind of idealism. His travels to Europe probably had something to do with this. For example, when you're in Florence, the capital of the Renaissance, and you're surrounded by Greek and Roman sculpture from antiquity and from the Renaissance, it's hard not to be influenced by that somehow. In Powers' first female nude, Eve Tempted, from 1843, we can see his reliance on classical Greek and Roman sculpture. In fact, he was part of what was called the Neoclassical sculptors. So neo meaning new and classical meaning classical. The reemergence of classical sculpture in the 1800s. We can see that she has the classical stance of contrapposto, one leg forward, one leg back, one leg bent, one leg straight. The hips are slightly swayed. She's also been exfoliated to perfection, so her skin seems super soft. In fact, Hiram Powers developed a technique in order to make the texture of the skin look so lifelike that people wanted to reach out and touch the statue. Usually, marble statues are polished to such a degree that if a person reached out and touched them, the surface is sealed over and the oils of the hand would not disturb it. But Hiram Powers, since he developed special techniques to get this texture of the skin, the surface wasn't polished and sealed off. And in fact, people so wanted to touch his sculptures that the oils from their hands would often leave marks and degrade the surface of the sculpture. You know how the oil from your skin can leave like a yellowish tint? Well, when his sculptures went on display, he would have signs by them, please do not touch. But people still touch them because the perfection of the skin, that real lifelike texture of soft, smooth skin, was just so appealing to the audience. Classical Greek and Roman sculpture was only one reason for Hiram Powers' production of idealized female nudes. He also created these female nudes because of his Swedenborgianist beliefs. He believed in a deep connection between the soul and the body, and he was a firm Swedenborgianist. He was first introduced to Swedenborg by an employer he had, and then he was also influenced by one of the sculptors who trained him, who was also a Swedenborgianist. In fact, Hiram Powers was such a faithful devotee of Swedenborg that when he moved to Florence, he started his own new Church of Jerusalem there, his own section of it. His Swedenborgian beliefs definitely contributed to his outlook on aesthetics. One of Hiram Powers' quotes is, "The legitimate aim of art should be spiritual, and not animal. So already we see a duality between the material and the spiritual, the animal versus the human. Secondly, he says, the nude statue should be an unveiled soul. Powers wrote that he aimed at the pure image of God in his ideal work. I could never satisfy myself with an ideal work in a hurry. The human form is infinite. It is the image of God. This statement shows us that Powers was much akin to William Blake and Swedenborg in their belief that the human figure was divine and that it was a reflection of God itself, that God had the human figure, and that because God was the human archetypal figure, we, man, followed in his footsteps. This idea also links back to Swedenborg's belief that you even have a body after death, a spiritual body, not a material body, but a spiritual body. It harkens back to the idea that everything is a reflection of a reflection of a reflection of the truth, much like Plato's forms. Man is a reflection of God. The body is a reflection of the soul. The idea of the material revealing the nature of the spiritual was not just a concept coming from Swedenborg. It was also coming from a popular science called phrenology in the early 1800s. Now today, phrenology is just considered a pseudoscience, but back then people really respected phrenology. It was the idea that you can study the physical body of someone, and from that you can learn about their character. And it especially studied the skull. So they believed that the slant of the forehead or where certain bumps were in the skull could reveal moral character, could reveal a person's temperament. The logic was that your mind creates the shape of your brain, and your skull houses your brain. Therefore, the peculiarities of your skull reveal your brain, which reveals your mind, which reveals your temperament, your character, your basic inner core. Unsurprisingly, Powers was a big fan of phrenology, and we can see this in two of his sculptures. The first one we're going to look at is called California, and it shows the personification of the state of California as a Native American woman. She's holding a divining rod in her hand, and she is standing next to a cluster of crystals. The divining rod that she's holding in her hand is a divinatory tool that many prospectors used in order to find natural resources like oil, clean water, or gold. Basically, it was a forked branch, so two branches that led into one branch, and you would hold the fork of each branch in your hand, the singular branch pointing outwards, and you would ask the branches questions, and it would give you yes or no bobs, telling you which direction you should go in or where the treasure would be located. Many people, even those who weren't prospectors, would use this divinatory tool, this divining rod, in order to locate treasure on their properties. So if they were looking for gold coins or artifacts, they would have fun asking this forked branch questions that would lead them to what they were looking for. The reason why California, the statue, is holding a divining rod is because this tool was often used by the 49ers, the people who were looking for gold in 1849 California gold rush. They would use this tool to help them locate where they should pan for gold. If you look at this sculpture, you may think to yourself, she doesn't look anything like a Native American, even though, according to Hiram Powers, she was supposed to represent one. The face especially, it looks very European. In fact, Powers was very strategic in the way that he shaped the skull and the head in this sculpture. He says that she was broad at the temples, the head small and round. The reason why he gave her these attributes was because of his underlying belief in phrenology. In phrenology, roundness was a positive attribute in the female skull because it signified a uniform temperament. Roundness meant uniformity, which meant that she was neither too confident nor too mild, neither too logical nor too emotional. She was uniform in every way, and that was a desirable attribute for females at the time. Another reason why he would have given her a small head is because she was a Native American, and in phrenology there was this underlying justification of racism because of someone's physical appearance. So a small skull would indicate a lack of reasoning ability, a lack of strength. Therefore, because she's a Native American, he portrayed her with an inferior phrenological character. However, he had to show some ability of her being able to use the divining rod. Therefore, he made her broad at the temples, and this showed that she had enough reasoning ability to correctly use the divining rod in order to find the gold. We see this phrenological justification of racism in another one of his statues called The Last of the Tribes, which also portrays a Native American. In this sculpture, a Native American woman is fleeing, and he says she is hopeless and knows not whither to turn. In order to show her confusion and her lack of reasoning ability, he makes her forehead very slanted. To the phrenologist, this was showing these kind of detriments of character. Unfortunately, phrenology was oftentimes used as a subtle justification as to why the European Americans could displace Native Americans, why some races were superior to other races. And we can see this unhealthy underlying thought pattern in the way that Hiram Powers depicts these two Native American women. Another belief system that was prominent in the early 1800s, besides phrenology, was a thing called Mesmerism. This was named after its founder, Franz Anton Mesmer, who was a healer of sorts of his day. Mesmer would heal you through the use of magnets and psychic powers. He would put you into a trance of sorts and then work on you once you were mesmerized. So that is how we get the word mesmerized. It's from this guy from the early 1800s, Franz Anton Mesmer. And Mesmer believed that there was this fluid magnetism that ran through all of us. It's kind of like the idea of chi or prana in the Eastern or Indian religious beliefs. When the magnetic fluid inside of each of us is out of balance, it results in ill health, and therefore Mesmer would put you into a trance, and he would also use magnets to realign your health, to retune your magnetic fluids. Now, why am I telling you about Mesmer? Well, it's because in the statue California, we can also see these big crystal clusters behind her. And this has to do with mesmerism, and it has to do with Swedenborg's idea of influx. Because you see, all of these pseudoscience spiritual beliefs were trading ideas with each other. Swedenborgianism was influencing Mesmerism. Mesmerism was influencing Swedenborgianism. Phrenology was another piece of the puzzle, and Hiram Powers believed in all of these systems. So if you remember, Swedenborg had this idea of influx. Basically, God was the source of love and light, and his love and light filtered down through each level of reality until it hits the physical plane. It enlivens the physical plane. It gives us life. It allows us to be alive, and we are just vessels that are filled with this influx from the higher spiritual planes. Influx was a lot like the spiritual magnetic fluid that Mesmer preached. Crystal clusters like the one in California were believed to be hot spots for the magnetic fluid or for Swedenborg's influx. They were believed to hold concentrated amounts of the life force, concentrated amounts of the spiritual magnetic fluid. This is why she is holding the divining rod next to a cluster of crystals, because places that had these clusters or these natural wonders giving off a high vibration, a high amount of this spiritual magnetic fluid, would allow people who were using divining rods to find those places. The divining rod was basically like an antenna honing on to places that emitted this frequency, that emitted this extra concentrated influx from God. You have to remember that Swedenborgianists believed that this influx basically enlivened the earth and gave it structure. So without the influx of God, the earth would be dead. But places that had these special geological formations like crystals held an extra concentrated amount of this influx. And these places allowed people who were searching for natural resources to find them because they admitted this power. Not all of Hiram Power's works portrayed some sort of Swedenborgianist philosophy. You have to remember that sculpture was an extremely costly business, and it would take him either a year to a year and a half to complete each one of these sculptures. Therefore, he couldn't risk alienating patrons who may not have the same beliefs as him. We see his beliefs shine through in little details, like the divining rod, like the crystal cluster. In this small sculpture, we see a baby's hand emanating from a sunflower. This is called Loulie's hand, and it was a sculpture commemorating the birth of his daughter Louisa. Such images were very popular in the Victorian era. They extended from the phrenological belief that every part of your body tells you some part about your character. One of the reasons that Hiram Powers chose a sunflower around his daughter's hand was this flower's spiritual association with the sun. If you remember, Swedenborg believed that there was a spiritual sun from which all life emanated from, and it's not surprising that we see a hand emanating from a sunflower, a literal representation of the human being born of the divine. In one of Hiram Power's most famous sculptures, called The Greek Slave, we see a nude woman chained at the wrists, looking off to the side. She is representing a historical event, that of the Turkish conquest of Greece. And according to Powers, she is a Christian Greek whose family was slayed by the Turks, and who was taken by the Turks to be sold on the slave market. You may notice when you're looking at Hiram Powers that there is a dissonance between what you're seeing and what he writes about his sculptures. Yes, there are the chains around her wrist to show that she is a slave, and yes, there is a small cross hanging off of her wrist to let you know that she's a Christian. But outside of these factors, there's not much that you can tell about who she is, what she's doing, or why she's there. In fact, some art historians say that the morality of this piece that Hiram Powers writes about overrides the eroticism of this piece. And I feel like that happens with a lot of Hiram Powers sculptures. They seem very erotic, very Venusian. Yet when you read Powers' commentary on them, it doesn't really match up with what you're seeing. The American public was not used to seeing nude sculptures, so normally there would be a reaction of disapproval from an American audience. European audiences were very used to nude figures, but American audiences were more conservative, and therefore, in order for them to accept a piece like this, it had to be drenched in a certain morality. The Greek slave was praised as being a figure who showed virtue, piety, modesty, despite the fact that she was wearing no clothes, because her head turned to the side showed that she resisted the conquest and kept her faith. In fact, one reviewer of the time said that she was clothed in piety and virtue. The idea that these spiritual virtues are somehow shining through her material body is another example of Power's belief in the unveiled soul, that his sculptures showed the character of the soul, that the material revealed the spiritual. In this way, we can see Emanuel Swedenborg's influence on Hiram Powers. But we also see many other 19th century sciences like phrenology and mesmerism coming into play in the way that he created his sculptures.